The most powerful army on earth had one mission: find the treasures of God and take them. But what happened next was not just a conquest. It was a complete annihilation. They didn't just loot a building. They smashed the pillars that marked the entrance to heaven. They tore apart sacred structures that had stood for centuries. They broke the Bronze Sea, a massive structure so large it looked like it belonged to another world. And the golden vessels, the cups, the instruments used in worship, they threw them into sacks, like they were nothing more than common kitchen tools. No reverence, no fear, just destruction. And then they set it all on fire. Flames climbed the walls. Smoke filled the sky. And in a single day, the most sacred place on earth was reduced to ash. The temple was gone. But here is what makes this story different from every other conquest in history. God saw it coming. God allowed it. And God had already left the building before the first torch was thrown. The king behind this destruction was Nebuchadnezzar II, a man who didn't just see himself as a ruler, he saw himself as unstoppable. By the time he rose to power, Babylon had become the most feared empire in the world. His army was massive, disciplined, relentless. They didn't just win battles. They erased cities. They crushed nations. They humiliated kings. They dominated everything in their path. And when people heard Babylon was coming, they didn't fight. They surrendered. But Jerusalem was different, because the people there believed something no other nation believed. They believed their God ruled the entire earth. They believed that inside one building, on one mountain, God himself lived among them. And as long as that temple stood, they believed they were untouchable. But they misunderstood something critical. They thought God was bound to a place. They thought his presence was guaranteed. They thought the building was the source of their protection. But they were wrong, because what they didn't realize was that God had already begun to leave. Long before the armies arrived, something had already gone wrong. The warnings came first. Prophets stood in the streets, crying out, begging, warning, turn back, stop what you're doing, judgment is coming. But the people ignored them. The leaders ignored them. Even the kings refused to listen, because everything looked fine on the outside. The temple still stood. The rituals continued. The sacrifices were made. But inside, everything was broken. Idolatry had spread everywhere. They worshipped other gods. They trusted political alliances. They believed human strategy could save them. They stopped trusting God and started trusting everything else. So God made a decision, not to destroy them immediately, but to warn them, again and again and again. But they didn't listen, and eventually, warning turned into action. The first time Babylon came, it wasn't to destroy, it was a warning. The city was surrounded. The king surrendered, and Babylon took something important. Not everything, just enough. They took the best of the people, the skilled, the strong, the valuable, and they took some of the treasures from the temple. Then they left. The message was clear. Submit and live. Rebel, and everything will be taken. For a moment, it worked. The new king obeyed. The city survived. But pride is a slow poison. Over time, pressure built. Voices rose. False prophets spoke. You're safe. Nothing will happen. God will protect this city. And the king believed them. Instead of truth, instead of warning, instead of God, he chose pride. He rebelled. And that decision changed everything. Because this time, Babylon wasn't coming to warn. They were coming to end it. The army returned, stronger, more determined, more ruthless than ever before. And this time, they didn't attack right away. They surrounded the city. No one in, no one out. And they waited, because they knew something powerful. You don't always have to destroy a city from the outside. Sometimes, You let it collapse from within. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Food ran out. Water became scarce. Hope disappeared. And slowly, Jerusalem began to die. Not by swords, but by hunger. The strongest became weak. The rich became poor. The proud became desperate. The streets filled with suffering. Silence replaced celebration, and fear replaced faith. The people who once believed they were untouchable now struggled to survive another day. Because when you turn away from truth, the consequences don't come all at once. They come slowly, until one day, you realize you're trapped, and there's no way out. And by the time the enemy finally breaks in, you've already been defeated. By the time the walls finally broke, Jerusalem was already finished. After months of starvation, after years of suffering, the Babylonian army didn't storm a strong city. They walked into a graveyard. The gates collapsed. The defenses failed, and the soldiers poured in. There was no resistance left. Only fear, only silence, only the sound of footsteps, echoing through a dying city. The king tried to escape. Under the cover of darkness, he fled through a hidden path. But you can't outrun consequences. He was captured, dragged before Nebuchadnezzar II. And what happened next was meant to send a message so brutal, it would never be forgotten. Everything he had built, everything he had trusted, was stripped away in a single moment. And then, he was taken away in chains. A king, reduced to nothing. But even that was not the worst part, because what came next was the destruction of something far greater than a throne. The temple. For generations, this had been the center of everything. Not just religion, not just culture, but identity. It was where heaven met earth, where God's presence dwelled. Or at least, that's what they believed. When the Babylonian soldiers entered the courtyard, they didn't see something sacred. They saw something valuable, something to take apart, something to break. The great bronze pillars, symbols of strength and stability, were torn down. They crashed to the ground, with a force that shook the very foundation beneath them. The Eye's Bronze Sea, that massive structure that once held water for purification, was shattered into pieces, not because they needed to destroy it, but because it was easier to carry that way. Piece by piece, they dismantled everything: the golden lampstands, the sacred tools, the vessels used in worship, all of it, thrown into sacks, handled without care, without understanding, without fear. What had once been holy was now just loot. And then, they reached the place no one was supposed to enter. The Holy of Holies, the most sacred room in the entire temple, a place so holy that even the high priest entered it only once a year. And even then, with fear, because it was believed that if he entered unworthily, he would die instantly. That's how powerful this place was. That's how real the presence of God was believed to be. So imagine the moment when pagan soldiers, with no reverence, no preparation, no fear, walked straight in. They pushed past the veil, raised their torches, and looked inside, expecting to find the greatest treasure in the world. The Ark of the Covenant, the very symbol of God's presence. But instead, they found nothing. The room was empty. No ark, no glory, no presence, just silence, just darkness. Because God was already gone. This is the part of the story most people miss. The Babylonians didn't defeat God. They didn't overpower him. They didn't steal his throne. God left. Before they ever arrived, what they destroyed was an empty shell. And yet, they believed they had won. They took the treasures back to Babylon, displayed them in their temples, placed them before their gods, as proof that they were greater, that their empire was unstoppable. And for a time, it looked like they were right. Babylon became the center of the world. Wealth flowed in, power increased, Its walls stood high. Its gates stood strong. Its kings ruled with absolute authority. And the treasures of Jerusalem sat there as trophies, silent reminders of a fallen nation. Years passed. The memory of Jerusalem faded. The temple, forgotten. But God had not forgotten, because God's timing does not follow human timelines. It doesn't rush. It doesn't delay. It unfolds exactly as planned. And one night, everything changed. A king named Belshazzar decided to throw a feast. Not just any feast, a celebration of power, of dominance, of victory. The room was filled with nobles. Wine flowed freely. Laughter echoed through the halls. But that wasn't enough, because pride always wants more. So he made a decision, a dangerous one. He ordered the sacred vessels from the temple to be brought out. The same cups, once used in the worship of the living God, were now being used for entertainment, mockery, blasphemy. He lifted one of the cups, filled it with wine, and drank, as if nothing mattered, as if there were no consequences, as if God was gone forever. And in that moment, something appeared, not a soldier, not an enemy, not a warning from man, but something supernatural, a hand floating in the air, right in front of everyone. And it began to write. Letters formed on the wall, glowing, unmistakable, unexplainable. The music stopped. The laughter died. The room fell into silence. Because suddenly, everyone realized something. This wasn't a celebration anymore. This was judgment. The king's face turned pale. His confidence disappeared. His strength vanished. Because deep down, he knew this was real, and whatever was happening was not in his control. So he called for someone to explain it, someone who could read the message. And that's when an old prophet was brought in, a man who had seen empires rise and fall. He looked at the writing and delivered a message that would end everything. Your kingdom has been weighed and found wanting, and tonight it will fall. That same night, everything changed. While the king and his nobles were still celebrating, while the music still echoed through the halls, while the sacred cups were still in their hands, the empire began to fall. Outside the city, an army was already moving, silent, strategic, unstoppable, led by Cyrus the Great. But this was not a normal attack. There were no loud battles at the gates, no massive siege towers. Instead, they used something far more precise. They diverted the river that flowed through Babylon, lowered the water level, and marched their army straight under the walls. While the city celebrated, the enemy walked in, street by street, step by step. No resistance, no warning. And before the sun could rise, Babylon, the greatest empire on earth, was gone. The king who mocked God was dead. Just like that, the message written on the wall was fulfilled. Because no matter how powerful an empire looks, when God says it's over, it's over. But the story doesn't end there. Because God wasn't just bringing judgment, he was fulfilling a promise. Years before Jerusalem fell, a prophecy had been spoken that after a set time, the people would return. And now, that moment had come. Cyrus took the throne, and instead of crushing the people of Israel, he did something no one expected. He gave a command, not to destroy, but to rebuild. He ordered that the temple in Jerusalem be restored. And more than that, he returned the treasures, the same golden vessels that had been taken as trophies were now being sent back home, carefully, intentionally, completely, because what God promises, he restores. The people returned, step by step, back to a land that once felt lost forever. But when they arrived, they didn't find glory. They found ruins, burned stones, broken walls, ash where a temple once stood, and many of them wept. because the place they remembered was gone. But even in the ruins, God was still working. They began to rebuild, stone by stone, wall by wall. Faith returned, hope returned, and eventually, the temple stood again. But something was different. Something was missing. No glory filled the room. No overwhelming presence. No Ark of the Covenant. The Holy of Holies was empty, just like before, and for years, nothing changed. For decades, silence. For centuries, waiting. People prayed. They hoped. They wondered. Would God ever return? And then, after hundreds of years, he did, but not in the way anyone expected. Not as fire, not as a cloud, not between golden cherubim, but as a man, Jesus Christ, walked into that very temple. The same place that had once burned, the same place that had once stood empty. And when he stood there, he said something that shocked everyone. "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." They didn't understand. They thought he was talking about the building, but he wasn't. He was talking about himself, because everything that temple represented was pointing to him. The presence of God, no longer hidden behind a veil, no longer locked inside a room, but walking, breathing, living among people. And when he died, something happened that changed everything forever. The veil of the temple, the barrier between man and God, was torn from top to bottom, not by human hands, but by God himself, because at that moment, God was making something clear. He was no longer living in buildings made of stone. From that day forward, his presence would not be found in temples. It would be found in people, in hearts, in lives, in anyone who believes. And that changes everything, because it means something powerful. Sometimes, God will allow the things we build to fall apart, the things we trust, the things we depend on, the things we believe we can't live without. And when they collapse, it feels like destruction. It feels like loss. It feels like everything is over. But maybe it's not the end. Maybe it's God showing us something deeper, that we were trusting the structure instead of him, that we were holding on to something temporary instead of something eternal, because God will never share his place with anything else. So if something had to be removed, it wasn't to destroy you. It was to redirect you, to bring you back to what truly matters. So let me ask you something. Have you ever had something fall apart in your life? Something you thought you couldn't survive losing, only to realize later it was exactly what you needed? If this message spoke to you, don't ignore it. Take a moment, reflect, and if you're willing, share your story in the comments, because someone out there needs to hear it. And if this video opened your eyes, help it reach someone else. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs this reminder. Because sometimes, what looks like the end is actually the beginning of something greater.